Isabel, Allende, House of the Spirits, Part 7. The place was full of dust and spider webs and looked thoroughly abandoned. Clearly, in all those years, none of the tenant farmers had dared to leave his hut to move into the large, empty house of the absent owner. They had not touched the furniture. It was all as it had been when he was a child, each piece exactly where it had stood before, except uglier and more lugubrious and rickety than he remembered. The entire house was carpeted with a thick layer of grass, dust, and dried-out leaves. It smelled like a tomb. A skeletal dog barked angrily at him, but Esteban Trueba paid him no attention until the dog, too tired to continue, lay down in a corner to scratch his fleas. Esteban put his bags on a table and set out to walk through the house, fighting off the sadness that was beginning to overwhelm him. He went from one room to another, noticing how time had worn everything away, and the poverty and dirt, and it seemed to him that this was a hole far worse than the mine. The kitchen was a wide, filthy room with a high ceiling and walls blackened with smoke from the wood and coal stoves, moldy and in ruins. The copper pots and pans that had not been used for 15 years, apparently untouched in all that time, still hung from the nails. The bedrooms had the same beds and huge wardrobes with full-length glasses that his father had bought long ago, but the mattresses were a pile of rotten wool in which bugs had nested for generations. He heard the faint passage of the rats in the rafters. He could not tell if the floors were made of wood or tiles because they were invisible, completely covered with grime. A layer of dust blurred the contours of the furniture. Where the drawing room had been, he could see the German piano with one broken leg and yellow keys, which sounded like an untuned harpsichord. On the shelves there were still a few illegible books, their pages chewed up by the damp, and on the floor there were the remnants of ancient magazines whose pages had been scattered by the wind. The armchairs sat with their springs sticking out, and there was a mouse nest in the wing chair where his mother had liked to knit before her illness turned her hands to claws. When he finished his tour, Esteban had a clearer view of things. He knew that an immense task lay ahead of him, for if the house was in such bad repair, he could scarcely expect the rest of the property to be in any better condition. For a second he was tempted to pile his 2 bags on the cart and return whence he had come, but he rejected that plan in a flash and resolved if there was anything that could alleviate the grief and rage of Rosa's loss, it would be breaking his back working in this ruined land. He took off his coat, drew a deep breath, and went into the courtyard where the woodcutter was still waiting, not far from the tenants who had grouped themselves at a certain distance, with the shyness typical of country people. They looked at each other with curiosity. Trueba took 2 steps toward them and noticed a slight backward movement in the tiny cluster. He let his eyes wander over the shabby peasants and tried to force a friendly smile to the runny-nosed children, the bleary-eyed old people, and the women without hope, but it came out like a grimace. "Where are the men?" he asked. The only young man stepped forward. He was probably the same age as Esteban Trueba, but he looked older. "They left," he said. "What's your name?" "Pedro Segunda Garcia, sir," the man replied. "I'm the patron here now. The party's over. We're going to work. Anyone who doesn't like the idea should clear out immediately. Whoever stays won't lack for food, but he'll have to work good and hard. I don't want any deadbeats or smart Alecs around, you understand?" They looked at each other in amazement. They had not understood half of what he had said, but they could recognize their master's voice when they heard it. "We understand, patron," Pedro Garcia said. "We have nowhere to go. We have always lived here, and will stay." A little boy squatted on the ground and began to defecate, and a mangy dog ran up to sniff him. Revolted, Esteban ordered them to take the child away, hose the courtyard down, and kill the dog. Thus began the new life that, in time, would make him forget Rosa. No one's going to convince me that I wasn't a good patron. Anyone who saw Tres Marias in decline and who could see it now when it's a model estate, would have to agree with me. That's why I can't go along with my granddaughter's story about class struggle, because when it comes right down to it, those poor peasants are a lot worse off today than they were 50 years ago. I was like a father to them. Our agrarian reform ruined things for everyone. I used all the money I had saved to marry Rosa and everything the foreman sent me from the mine to pull Tres Marias out of misery. But it wasn't money that saved the place. It was hard work and organization. The word went out that there was a new patron at Tres Marias and that we were using mules to clear the land of stones and plow the fields to ready them for planting. In no time at all, men began to arrive, offering their service as hired hands, because I paid well and gave them meals. I bought animals. Animals were sacred to me, and even if we had to go a year without eating meat, they were never killed. Thus our livestock prospered. I organized the men into different crews, and after they had finished working in the fields, we set to work on restoring the main house. They weren't carpenters or masons, and I had to teach them everything from books I bought. We even did the plumbing. We fixed the roofs, whitewashed the house from top to bottom, and cleaned it inside and out until it sparkled. I distributed the furniture among the various tenants, except the dining room table, which was still intact despite the worms that had gotten into everything, and the wrought iron bed that had belonged to my parents. I continued living in the empty house with no other furniture apart from those two pieces and a few wooden crates to sit on until Firula sent me the new furniture I'd ordered from the capital. They were large, heavy, ostentatious pieces that were built to last for generations and to withstand country life. The proof is that it took an earthquake to destroy them. I arranged them along the walls with an eye more to convenience than aesthetics, and once the house was comfortable, I felt happy and began to get used to the idea that I was going to spend many years, perhaps even my whole life, in Tres Marias. The tenants' wives took turns as servants in the main house, and they also tended my orchard. I soon saw the first flowers in the garden I had planned out with my own hand, and that, with a few minor changes, is the same ones that's there today. In those days, people worked without grumbling. I think my presence made them feel secure again. They saw the land gradually restored to prosperity. They were good, simple men with no rebels among them. It's also true that they were very poor and very ignorant. Before I got there, they were just tilling their own small family plots, which provided them with the bare necessities to keep them from starving to death, providing, of course, that they weren't struck by some catastrophe such as drought, frost, plague, ants, or snails, in which case things became very difficult indeed. But after I arrived, all that changed. One by one, we rescued the old fields. We rebuilt the chicken coops and stables and began to plan an irrigation system so that crops wouldn't have to depend on the weather. But it wasn't an easy life. It was very hard. Sometimes I would walk to town and return with the veterinarian who would check the cows and hens, and while he was at it, anybody who was sick. It's not true that I assumed that if the vet knew how to treat animals, his training was good enough for people, as my granddaughter says when she wants to get me mad. The fact is, you couldn't get a doctor in a godforsaken place like that. The peasants went to an Indian curandera who knew all about the power of herbs and suggestion, and in whom they had great confidence, more than in the vet. Mothers gave birth with help from their neighbors, prayers, and a midwife, and almost never arrived on time because she had to make the trip by burro. But she was good at delivering babies, and she was at pulling calves from wall-eyed cows. Those who were gravely ill, whom no spell of the curandera or potion from the vet could help, were placed on a cart and taken by Pedro Segunda Garcia or me to a hospital run by nuns, where there was frequently a doctor who helped them die. The dead and their bones ended up in a tiny graveyard next to the abandoned church at the foot of the volcano, where there is now a proper cemetery. Once or twice a year, I arranged for a priest to come and bless unions, animals, and machines. baptize children, and say a belated prayer for the dead. The only amusement then was castrating pigs and bulls, cockfights, hopscotch, and the incredible tales of old Pedro Segundo, who, may he rest in peace. He was Pedro Segundo's father, and he said his grandfather had fought in the ranks of the patriots who kicked the Spaniards out of America. He showed the children how to let themselves be stung by spiders and drink the urine of pregnant women as a form of immunization. He knew almost as many herbs as the curandera, but he would get confused when it came to deciding on their use, and he had committed some irreparable mistakes. Nonetheless, I have to say that he had an unbeatable method for pulling teeth, which had made him justly famous throughout the region. It was a combination of red wine and Our Fathers, which plunged the patient into a hypnotic trance. He pulled one of my molars, and if he were alive today, he would be my dentist. I soon felt at home in the country. My closest neighbors were a good horse ride away, but I wasn't interested in having a social life. I enjoyed my solitude, and besides, I had a lot of work on my hands. I gradually became a savage. I began to forget words, my vocabulary grew smaller, and I became very demanding. Since I had no need to keep up appearances, the bad character I've always had only got worse. Everything made me angry. I got furious if I saw the children circling the kitchen to steal bread, if the hens were noisy in the courtyard, if sparrows invaded the cornfields. When my ill humor began to bother me and I felt uncomfortable in my own skin, I would go out hunting. I would wake up long before dawn and leave with my shotgun on my shoulder, with my game bag and my partridge hound. I liked to ride horseback in the dark, and I liked the cold air of those early hours, the long wait in the shadows, the silence, the smell of gunpowder and blood, the feel of the weapon drawn back against my shoulder with a dry knock, and the sight of the prey as it fell kicking. All this would calm me, and when I returned from hunting with 4 wretched rabbits in my pouch and a few partridges so full of holes that they couldn't even be cooked, half dead on my feet and covered with mud, I felt happy and relieved. Whenever I think back on those days, I feel a great sadness. My life has gone by very fast. If I had to do it all over again, there are a few mistakes I wouldn't make, but in general, there's nothing I regret. Yes, I've been a good patron, there's no doubt about it. The first months, Esteban Trueba was so busy channeling water, digging wells, removing stones, clearing pastures, and repairing the chicken coops and stables that he had no time to think about anything. He went to bed thoroughly exhausted and woke at dawn, stopping just long enough to eat a meager breakfast in the kitchen before riding off to supervise the work in the fields. He did not return till sundown. Only then did he sit down to eat his one real meal of the day, alone at the dining room table. The first months he kept his promise to himself of always bathing and changing his clothes for dinner, and he heard the British colonizers did in the most decent hamlets of Africa and Asia, so as not to lose their dignity and authority. He would put on his best clothes, shave, and play his favorite opera arias on the gramophone. But little by little he let himself be conquered by rusticity and came to accept the fact that he had no calling as a dandy, especially since there was no one to appreciate his efforts. He stopped shaving, cut his hair only when it reached his shoulders, and continued to bathe once a day only because the habit was so ingrained in him. But he grew indifferent to his clothes and manners. He was slowly becoming a barbarian. Before going to sleep, he would read for a while or play chess. He had developed the ability to compete against a book without cheating, and had learned to lose matches without getting mad. Still, the exhaustion produced by so much work was not enough to suppress his robust and sensual nature. He began to have difficult nights in which the blankets seemed excessively heavy to him, the sheets too light. His horse played nasty tricks on him, suddenly becoming a formidable female, a hard, wild mountain of flesh, on which he rode until his bones ached. The warm aromatic melons in his orchard looked to him like enormous breasts, and he was astonished to find himself burying his face in his saddle blanket, seeking in the sour smell of the horse's sweat the forbidden, distant scent of his first prostitute. During the night he sweated through nightmares of rotten shellfish, of enormous slabs of raw beef, of blood, of semen, and tears. He would wake up tense, with his penis like an iron rod between his legs, angrier than ever. Hoping for relief, he would run out and plunge naked into the icy waters of the river until he couldn't breathe, but then he would feel invisible hands stroking his legs. Beaten, he would let himself float aimlessly, feeling the hug of the current, the kiss of the tadpoles, the lash of the rushes that grew along the banks. Soon his terrible need became notorious. Nothing could quench it, neither immersing himself in the river, nor cinnamon teas, nor placing a piece of flint beneath his mattress, nor even those shameful manipulations that drove the boys in boarding school out of their minds, left them blind, and plunged them into eternal damnation. When he began to look with concupiscent eyes at the birds in the coral, the children playing naked in the orchard, and even at raw bread dough, he understood that his virility would not be soothed by priestly substitutes. His common sense told him that he would have to find a woman, and once he had made up his mind, the terrible anxiety that afflicted him began to ebb, and his fury seemed to abate. That day he woke up smiling for the first time in months. Pedro Garcia, the old man, saw him whistling on his way to the stables and shook his head in wonder. All that day the patron was busy plowing a field that had been just cleared and that was slated to be planted with corn. Afterward he went with Pedro Garcia to attend to a cow who was in the process of giving birth and whose calf was turned the wrong way around. He had to stick his arm up to the elbow to turn the creature upside down and help it pull its head through. The cow died anyway, but he did not get upset about it. He ordered the cow bottle fed, washed himself in a pail, and got back on his horse. Normally it would have been his dinner time, but he was not hungry. He was in no hurry, for he had already made his choice. He had seen the girl many times carrying her sniveling little brother on her hip, with a bag on her shoulder and a water jug on her head. He had watched her washing her clothes. He'd watched her washing clothes, squatting on the flat stones of the river, her dark legs polished by the water, as she rubbed the faded rags with her rough peasant hands. She was big-boned and had an Indian face, with broad features, dark skin, and a sweet, peaceful expression. Her fleshy, ample mouth still had all its teeth, and when she smiled her whole face lit up, but that did not happen very often. She had the beauty of early youth, although he could see it would quickly fade, as it does with women who are born to have many children, work without rest, and bury their dead. Her name was Pancha Garcia, and she was 15 years old. When Esteban Trueba went out to look for her, it was already late in the afternoon, and the air was crisp. He rode his horse slowly through the long stretches of green that separated the pastures, asking after her as he went, until he spotted her on the path that led to her hut. She was doubled over beneath the weight of a sheath of hawthorn for the kitchen hearth, barefoot, her head bowed. He looked at her from high in his saddle and immediately felt the urgent desire that had been tormenting him for so many months. He trotted up until he was right beside her. She heard him, but she continued walking without looking up, following the custom of all women of her kind, who bow their heads before the male. Esteban bent down and removed her burden, held it in the air for a moment, and then hurled it violently to the side of the path. He threw his arm around her waist, swept her up with an animal-like grunt, and placed her before him in the saddle. The girl did not resist. He kicked his heels in the stirrups, and they took off at a gallop in the direction of the river. They dismounted without speaking and looked each other over. Esteban unfastened his broad leather belt and she stepped back, but he grabbed her with a single stroke of his hand. They fell arm in arm among the eucalyptus leaves. Esteban did not remove his clothes. He attacked her savagely, thrusting himself into her without preamble, with unnecessary brutality. He realized too late from the blood spattered on her dress that the young girl was a virgin, but neither Pancha's humble origin nor the pressing demands of his desire allowed him to reconsider. Pancha Garcia made no attempt to defend herself. She did not complain, nor did she shut her eyes. She lay on her back, staring at the sky with terror, until she felt the man drop to the ground beside her with a moan. She began to whimper softly. Beside her, her mother, and before her, her grandmother, had suffered the same animal fate. Esteban Trueba adjusted his trousers, fastened his belt, helped her to her feet, and lifted her onto the haunches of his horse. They headed back. He was whistling. She continued to weep. Before dropping her off at her hut, the patron kissed her on the lips. "Starting tomorrow, I want you to work in the house," he said. Pancha agreed without looking up. Her mother and her grandmother had also been servants in the man's house. That night, Esteban Trueba slept like an angel, without dreaming of Rosa. He woke the next morning full of energy, feeling taller and stronger. He set off for the fields, humming, and when he returned, Pancha was in the kitchen, busily stirring marmalade in a huge copper pot. That night he waited for her with impatience, and when the sounds of housework fell silent in the old adobe house, and the nocturnal scamperings of the rats began, he felt the girl's presence in the doorway of his room. "Come, Pancha," he called. It was not an order, but an entreaty. Now Esteban took the time to savor her fully and made sure that she felt pleasure too. He explored her slowly, learning by heart the smoky scent of her body and her clothes, in which had been washed with ash and pressed with coal-filled iron. He learned the texture of her straight dark hair, of her skin that was soft in the most hidden places and rough and calloused everywhere else, of her fresh lips, her tranquil sex, and her broad belly. He desired her calmly, initiating her into the most secret and most ancient of sciences. He was probably happy that night and the few nights after, as the two of them cavorted like two puppies in the huge wrought iron bed that had belonged to the first Trueba and was now somewhat wobbly, although it still withstood the thrust of love. Pancha Garcia's breast swelled and her hips filled out. Esteban Trueba's ill humor lifted for a while, and he took a certain interest in his tenants.